Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I will analyze the case of Kathleen Schroll. First I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Kathleen Schroll was born on August 5, 1962, in Kansas City, Kansas. After graduating from high school, Kathleen worked a series of jobs, eventually ending up as a systems coordinator for a credit union. She married a man named Carl Wayne Schroll, who was 19 years older than her. Carl worked for many years as an insurance agent before taking a job at a racetrack. In 2004, Kathleen started working as a housekeeper for a man with dementia named Owen Coons. Owen had a son named Pete, who lived in Independence, Missouri. Pete had been a mail carrier, but retired due to severe medical problems. In August 2006, Pete paid a visit to Owen, but Kathleen would not let him into the house. Pete contacted social services and accused Kathleen of mistreating his father. Eventually, social services determined that Kathleen had taken advantage of Owen. On January 15, 2007, Owen died at the age of 86. His son Pete was the sole heir to his estate, including his house. Kathleen was not happy about this. She claimed that Owen had promised her the house and his insurance benefit. Kathleen waged a legal battle to get control of Owen's estate, but it was not going well at all. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On April 5, 2008, Kathleen Schroll told her coworkers that Pete Coons threatened her at a gas station that morning before work. On the next day, April 6, she told her daughter the same story, but claimed that the threat occurred in the afternoon, which was after work. On Monday, April 7, 2008, at 2:28 a.m., Kathleen called her mother Elizabeth and said that Pete was in the house and stole a lawnmower out of the garage. He was going to kill her husband Carl and then kill her. His tracks were covered so no one would find out. Elizabeth asked Kathleen if she called the police. Kathleen responded no, then the call disconnected. Elizabeth called her son Randy, who called 911. 15 minutes later, the police arrived at Kathleen's house. They found the front door ajar and the lights on. 45-year-old Kathleen Schroll was dead on the living room floor with her Taurus .38 caliber revolver next to her foot. She had sustained a single gunshot wound to the back of her head. In the bedroom, the police found Kathleen's 64-year-old husband, Carl Schroll, dead on a bed. He had 2 gunshot wounds to his abdomen and a bullet grazed his head. The police incorrectly believed that the head wound was consistent with blunt force trauma. Initially, the police believed that Kathleen was the killer. She killed her husband Carl before turning the revolver on herself. Once the police found out about the call that Kathleen made to her mother implicating Pete in the crime, the police developed a new theory. They believed that Pete made entry into Kathleen's house, struck Carl in the head with some type of blunt object, somehow managed to get control of Kathleen's revolver, and shot both Kathleen and Carl to death. They noticed that Kathleen's 5-shot revolver had 1 intact cartridge and 4 spent cases, but they only found 3 bullets. Years later, the 4th bullet was found in the pillow which had been behind Carl's head. This was the bullet that grazed his head. No blunt object was involved in Carl's death. The police searched Pete's home, but they found no evidence connecting him to the deaths of Kathleen and Carl. An officer who stopped by Pete's house at 6 a.m. claimed that Pete's van was not there. This became a key piece of evidence in this case. On April 9, 2008, 2 days after the killings, Pete was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. In January 2009, the case went to trial. On January 23, Pete was found not guilty of murdering Carl, but guilty of murdering Kathleen. His sentence was 50 years to life in prison. On June 25, 2009, Pete was granted a new trial because the prosecution withheld evidence. Pete's computer had accessed the internet at 1:07 a.m. and 4:51 a.m. on the day of the murders. Kathleen called her mother at 2:28 a.m., saying that Pete was in her house. Pete could have accessed his computer at 1:07 a.m., drove to Kathleen's house, killed her and Carl, and made it home by 4:51 a.m. However, there was one problem. If Pete was back from committing the murders at 4:51 a.m., Why would he have left his house again? Again, a police officer claimed that Pete's van was not at his house at 6 a.m. Clearly, this officer was mistaken. Pete went to trial again in December 2009. The state presented the same evidence, except they had one new witness, a jailhouse informant named Robert Rupert. He claimed that while they were in jail together, Pete confessed to him. The story that Robert provided did not match the evidence in the case. For example, Robert provided the incorrect locations of the bodies. He said that Pete drove a Jeep to Kathleen's house, but Pete had sold the Jeep a year before the killings. And Robert claimed that Pete told him the murder weapon was a semi-automatic pistol. In reality, it was a revolver. Even though Robert had 28 convictions on his record and had zero credibility, the jury found him convincing. On December 17, 2009, Pete was convicted of first-degree murder. His sentence was 50 years to life in prison. On appeal, his sentence was reduced to 25 years to life. In October 2020, attorneys working for Pete accused the state of concealing evidence during the trial. As it turns out, the attorneys were correct. On November 5, 2020, Pete was exonerated and released from custody. He was looking forward to decades of peace and freedom, excited about a bright future. Unfortunately, this dream never came true. 108 days after being released from prison, Pete died at the age of 64. He had stage 4 lung cancer, which was not diagnosed in prison. After his death, the court granted him a certificate of innocence. All Pete's conviction and arrest records were expunged. Now moving to my analysis. Pete Coons maintained his innocence, he was exonerated, and he had a massive number of supporters. They argued that there was no credible evidence of Pete's guilt, and the prosecution broke the law in order to falsely convict Pete. The state, of course, disagreed. During Pete's 2 trials, they argued that Pete must have been the killer because Kathleen said he was in her house. This brings me to the question, was Pete guilty of murder? Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that he was guilty, starting with the inculpatory factors. Kathleen and Pete were in a contentious legal battle leading up to Kathleen's death. Right before she died, Kathleen called her mother and claimed that Pete was in her house. A jailhouse informant claimed that Pete confessed to him. That's pretty much it for the inculpatory factors. Moving to the exculpatory factors, at the time of her death, Kathleen was in serious financial trouble and facing legal problems. She had allegedly stolen money from Owen and from her employer. On the day she died, her supervisor at the credit union discovered that Kathleen had embezzled over $11,000. Kathleen told different stories about the alleged threat made by Pete at the gas station. Furthermore, video surveillance from the gas station proved that neither Kathleen nor Pete had been there at the times Kathleen specified. Kathleen died from a single gunshot wound to the back of her head, which she could have self-inflicted. She was the owner of the revolver that killed her. Her DNA was on the trigger, and gunshot residue was on her left hand. There were no signs of forced entry into Kathleen's house, and no sign of a struggle. Kathleen called her mother and said that Pete was in the house. This was the key evidence against Pete. If Kathleen was really afraid for her life, why did she call her mother and not call 911? The door was only 5 feet away from where Kathleen was found. Why didn't she run outside? It seems odd that during this life-and-death confrontation, Kathleen would take the time to say that Pete had covered his tracks. Why was that important information to reveal in that particular moment? One would think that Kathleen would be more worried about the murder part. Initially, the state claimed that Pete must have somehow gained entry into the house without breaking anything, struck Carl on the head with a blunt object, then shot Kathleen and Carl. As I mentioned, Carl had not been struck on the head with a blunt object. Rather, a bullet grazed his head. How did Pete manage to make entry, obtain Kathleen's revolver, and shoot her and her husband? This would be difficult for anybody, but Pete was in particularly poor health. He weighed over 250 pounds and had medical problems, which forced him to retire from his job as a mail carrier. During the time of the shootings, Pete had an alibi. His daughter and his daughter's boyfriend saw Pete on April 7 at around 2 or 2:30 a.m. when he left his bedroom to use the bathroom. At 3 a.m., they heard him coughing and tapping away at his computer keyboard. No physical evidence whatsoever connected Pete to the killings. No DNA, no hair, no fingerprints, no footprints, no gunshot residue, no electronic evidence, no surveillance video, nothing at all. There was no evidence that anyone had been in Kathleen's house at the time of the killings, except for Kathleen and her husband Carl. As far as the jailhouse informant, Robert Rupert, these types of informants should never be trusted under any circumstances. But Robert was particularly unreliable. Eventually, Robert admitted that he fabricated the entire story to get a reduced sentence. He was lying. Pete never confessed to him. When considering all the evidence in this case, do I believe that Pete Coons was guilty of murder? No, I do not believe he was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. As a matter of fact, I believe he was actually innocent. Pete had nothing to do with the killings. What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. Kathleen Schroll was self-centered, impulsive, irresponsible, cold, callous, greedy, manipulative, deceptive, vindictive, petty, erratic, a con artist, a fraudster, and had a sense of entitlement. She worked diligently to get close to Olin so that he would leave her his estate. Kathleen took advantage of him. After Olin died, Kathleen refused to accept defeat and decided to litigate against Pete. Kathleen's sense of entitlement was so powerful, she was angry at Pete for defending assets she was trying to steal from him. During the early morning hours of April 7, 2008, Kathleen realized that she was going to be arrested for embezzling from her employer. In addition, her debts were out of control, and she was losing the lawsuit against Pete. There was nothing that Kathleen could do to change her fate, but there was something she could do to make Pete's life miserable on her way out. Kathleen called her mother and falsely reported that Pete was in the house. She then took her revolver and shot her husband, Carl. In her final move, Kathleen made her exit from this world by her own hand. In all likelihood, she believed that, at the worst, her false claim about Pete would make his life unpleasant for a while. He would be the target of an embarrassing investigation, but nothing would come of it. He certainly would not be arrested. This was Kathleen's revenge, a petty and vindictive move to illustrate how much she hated Pete. Kathleen had no idea that the police and the prosecution would become unwitting conspirators in her plot to frame Pete. They were the best allies Kathleen could have ever hoped for. Through their incompetence and their concealment of evidence, the state falsely convicted Pete. I have covered thousands of cases during my time making videos. A fair number of them involve a person being falsely accused. Usually, in those types of cases, the state had some credible evidence pointing toward guilt. In this case, however, there was no credible evidence. The false prosecution of Pete represents one of the worst injustices I've ever covered. Every mistake that the police could make during an investigation was made in this case. Every mistake a prosecutor could make was made. Now moving to my final thoughts. Many people take comfort in the belief that wrongful convictions only happen to those who flirt with danger. They look at falsely convicted people as troublemakers who must have done something wrong, people who may not have committed this particular crime, but certainly they committed others for which they escaped responsibility. The entire justice system would not conspire against one individual who did nothing wrong, would not falsely arrest them, would not falsely convict them, and definitely would not conceal evidence of their innocence. There is no way that could possibly happen. As it turns out, it can happen, and it did happen in this case. This is one of those cases that should rattle people's faith in the criminal justice system. While issuing a certificate of innocence for Pete was the right thing to do, it came too late to right even the smallest part of this wrong. Those are my thoughts on the case of Kathleen Schroll. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon. Just a reminder that I have over 300 pre-release videos on Patreon. These videos are of the same quality as the videos that I release to the public. When I put a video in pre-release status, it stays there usually for months, if not a year. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video.